But if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the rule, and this they will do.
Everything out of the ordinary is to be reported.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
That's an interesting picture. It was a church. Do you know that word? Yes, there were still churches when I was a child.
You know, there was a time in human history when God and the hand of science were the same.
MK Ultra mind control rules in Hollywood. If you don't know, Google that and look into it.
Some of the names of criminals is hardly informing.
They're not criminals, Musala. They're patriots.
Patriots!
Like patriots!
You're listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina.
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Hey everybody, it's Natalina and you're listening to Beyond Extraordinary. I'm coming to you as usual from my own little slice of paradise on the border between Minnesota and North Dakota. And the reason I say it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood is because it was actually slightly above 0 degrees today. I was outside running some errands and I thought to myself, wow, it is nice out today. The sun was shining, and I thought it's got to be like 20 degrees or something. And I ended up looking at the temperature, and it was like 1 degree. It was still like -7 with wind chill, but compared to what we have been dealing with this doggone polar vortex and blizzard after blizzard after blizzard up here, even 1 degree feels pretty doggone nice. So maybe it's an indicator that things are going to start warming up. I won't hold my breath, but we'll see what happens. Tonight, you are going to be treated to an interview with my good friend Doug Woodward, who has written a new book called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. And you may recall, Doug was on our show a couple months ago, and he was talking about his book, Power Quest Book 1. And during that interview, he hinted that he had been working on this book about Mars. So we've been looking forward ever since to talking to him about the book and about his research and the conclusions that he had come to and the things that he had learned. And so here he is. We are going to discuss all of these things with him. And, it's going to challenge you maybe. And, Doug is the first one to say he's not asking you to believe all of the things he puts forth in the book. In fact, he himself does not embrace all of the theories and hypotheses that he puts forward in the book. But his argument is it's worthy to consider it and think about it because, the other side, the world, the secular world, is talking about these types of things, and most people believe that that we live in a supernatural world, and they think about things like extraterrestrials and UFOs, and if we're not going to talk about it, they're going to go to the New Age, they're going to go to the atheists, they're going to start thinking about ancient aliens and panspermia and all of these things. And why not just discuss it on our end, even if it's just speculation? There's nothing wrong with that. And that's what we're doing tonight, talking to Doug. Before we jump into that, I will tell you right now, I am listening to, you can maybe hear some music in the background. Just to set the mood, I'm listening to Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite, and this is the movement called Mars, Bringer of War. So appropriate for tonight's show. thank you to everyone who's been visiting extraordinaryintelligence.com, leaving feedback, leaving your thoughts, emailing me. You know, I have been sick. I've been really sick for the past almost 3 weeks now with bronchitis, and I'm only just now starting to feel a little bit better. In fact, you'll hear me coughing a little bit throughout my interview with Doug, and so I apologize in advance for that. But so I've gotten a little bit behind on answering my emails and my Facebook messages and all of that. So please bear with me and keep send. You know, if you sent me something and it's been a number of weeks since I replied, feel free to reach out to me again and just kind of resend your message. It might have gotten lost in the shuffle. I do get a lot of emails and messages every single day. So when you're at extraordinaryintelligence.com, please make sure that you share the links with your friends and you check out some of the recent articles. I recently wrote an article about Vladimir Putin, and it's gotten a really interesting response. You know, a lot of people agree with me that there seems to be a disturbing trend of conservatives embracing Putin and his propaganda that he's putting forward. He's kind of positioning himself as like a conservative hero, when in reality there are many reasons to be very wary of Vladimir Putin and his totalitarian ideals. So have a look at that. The other side of the token, people telling me that Vladimir Putin is the ideal Christian man and he's some sort of a world hero, and I don't know, that baffles my mind. But read the article, see what you think, and leave me your feedback. In the meantime, if you listen via iTunes, as usual, I'm going to ask you to give us a rating and review, and we thank those of you who have done so thus far. It helps us a lot. We're still a relatively new podcast, although it seems like I've been doing it for a long time, kind of, doesn't it? The ratings and reviews really, really help us on that front. And if you want to help extraordinaryintelligence.com, I've got a few projects in the works that are going to require me to invest a little bit of extra time and money into it. So if you want to help me out, there is a donate button on the right-hand sidebar of extraordinaryintelligence.com. Your help is always appreciated. Or you can go to extraordinaryboutique.com, where I sell my handmade jewelry, and you can check out what's available there. Not a lot of new stuff, but a lot of cool stuff still available in the inventory on the site. And when I get back from my vacation, which I'm leaving on Wednesday to go to Memphis and visit my darling friend Michelle and her even more darling daughter, Claire Eileen, a little Southern Belle. When I get back from there, I'm going to be putting a lot more inventory on the site. So anyway, this music is getting pretty intense, so that must mean it is time to go to Doug Woodward. Thanks, everybody.
They came from the depths of outer space. They attacked planet Earth. It's time to fight back.
We know they're extremely advanced technologically, which suggests, very rightfully so, that they're peaceful.
People say they're ugly, but I think they've come to show us the way.
It takes its name from the Roman god of war. A distant, rusty orb in the night sky. A source of rampant speculation for centuries. Could it be home to a rival civilization?
The problem of the face on Mars has not gone away. It's gotten deeper, more profound, more provocative, and more insidious.
What can explain the inhuman discoveries made on Mars? Bizarre structures, possible alien remains, and what could be an alien figure caught on NASA cameras. Is mankind on the verge of discovering alien life on Mars? Or have we already found proof of Martian Martian civilizations.
This almost appears to be a whole city unexplored on the surface of Mars.
The shocking truth of a world that could hold the key to our past and our future.
Amazing underground Martian cities, a planet of wonders, both scientific and human, of exciting beauty.
Where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom!
So back in September, I had the pleasure of interviewing author S. Douglas Woodward about his Power Quest Book 1. It was a really fascinating interview, and actually it's been one of the most popular episodes we've done so far on Beyond Extraordinary. It still gets lots of downloads. And in that interview, we talked about America's historical and current obsession with the paranormal. And in that interview, Doug hinted that he was working on a new book, this time about the planet Mars. And ever since then, I've been eager to read the book and discuss the topic with Doug, which is exactly what we're going to do right now. So, Doug, welcome back to Beyond Extraordinary.
Hey, thank you, Natalina. It's so much fun. I've been looking forward to this interview because I know it's sort of a no holds barred discussion, and we can kind of talk about some of the maybe darker, more sinister aspects to the book, and so that'll be kind of fun for me.
It's got this book. It covers so much ground, and initially when I heard you were writing about the book, I thought it was going to be about the planet Mars. I thought, this is going to be such a departure from the things that you've written about in the past, whether, in your Power Quest books, it dealt very much with the supernatural and the paranormal and history thereof. And then in your book, The Final Babylon, you talk more about the Antichrist and prophecy and this type of thing. And so I thought, now this is really a departure. However, in reading the book, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, I find that it actually does tie in very much so with a lot of what you've written about in the past. In some ways, it reads almost as a continuation of the things that you've written about before. Was this something that was intentional, just sort of picking up from where you left off with your previous work?
Well, I don't know that it initially that I thought of it in that way. I think that to some extent the fact that the book tends to mirror the obsession that America has had historically with the occult, it kind of indirectly fits into that, because so much of the story of Mars is related to the paranormal, as we'll discuss. It certainly has been Americans and American science and American rocket science that has been predominantly responsible for exploring Mars. And so there are some consistent themes, and we'll hit those, of course, as we talk. But yeah, I think part of it is just these are areas that interest me, and so naturally I'm going to forget what I said in one of the books, and I'll say it again here.
Well, and none of it's repetitive, but it certainly seems like it if you were interested in the previous works written by Doug Woodward, this is not something that is going to just give you a full 180, although it definitely talks about some stuff that might challenge readers. It remains a book that is biblically grounded, and that kind of sticks along, as you say, the themes of the paranormal and the supernatural and that type of thing. Right. So, and thank goodness you got it all done and out there for us to read just in time to become a new grandpa.
Hey, I did, and that, of course, is really the most important new thing that has become public, is that my new grandson Brody appeared on the scene just about a week ago now. And so that was a better new entrance into the family, more so than the book. But I am glad that I got the book done. The book had been something I've been working on for almost 14 months. So it was probably a labor of love, though. I probably had more fun writing this book than any other book I've written.
Well, it definitely translates, because I can kind of just sense the wonderment and the excitement as I read it. I can feel like I'm sort of in your shoes as you were researching it and uncovering all of these different subjects. So, like I said, I've been looking forward to it since our last interview.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, and I'm holding the book in my hands right now. I have to say it's very fascinating. Another work well done. But before we get into the specifics of it, let's start with an overview. What really actually inspired you as a Christian researcher to take on the topic of the Red Planet, and kind of what's your main thesis with this book?
Yeah, well, it relates to the ongoing popularity in our culture today of the notion of extraterrestrials. Very specifically, what we've seen on the History Channel and now H2, the ancient alien theorists, whether we're talking about Tsoukalos, Giorgio Tsoukalos, or Eric Van Dyneken, the late, Philip Coppens, who just passed away about a year ago. They're David Hatcher Childress. There's a number of folks that have written on this subject for the last couple of decades, Eric Van Dyneken for almost 4 decades. It's become such a popular topic. We're seeing so many television shows, so many movies. Even, for instance, people may or may not be aware that Zecharia Sitchin, he's also just passed away not that long ago, but he had written books on the planet Nibiru and so many strange topics. But it filtered into the movie Cowboys and Aliens that Harrison Ford, Daniel Craig starred in a couple of summers ago, and his thesis about the Anunnaki and the ancient cuneiform tablets from Sumeria, all this sort of got wrapped up into that movie. So it's become such a part of our popular culture. And we should go ahead and mention that L.A. Marzulli wrote the foreword to the book. L.A. and I have discussed these issues and these topics on a number of occasions, and certainly his ministry is built a lot around the paranormal, the UFOs, extraterrestrials, the Nephilim, and so forth. So there's some overlap with his interests and my interests, and so that's been a factor as well. But I've always loved the planet Mars. I've always been fascinated by it. And I'm probably no different than many people, because it's been a subject that, as we'll discuss, that has been popular in our culture for, believe it or not, almost 150 years. And so that's a big part of it. And then finally, I'd just say, the kind of the core issue is that I believe Mars, more than any other sort of single entity, has been responsible for the curiosity, the interest in extraterrestrials for over a century. I believe that it has had a huge impact upon extraterrestrial-based religions, and there have been many, including like Scientology, the Raelians, just a whole slew of even Theosophy is based to a great extent on the concept of ancient aliens that have been on the Earth before and influenced ancient civilizations. But I believe it's going to be influential again. It already is in our day. We'll probably get into some of those subjects that are very, very peculiar, that take us down some rabbit holes. And I think that Mars is going to be a big part of what we call the final great deception that will be part and parcel of the coming of the Antichrist. So I think it's very relevant.
It is. And, you mentioned ancient aliens, and indeed the very subheading on the cover of your book reads, "Exposing the Lie of Ancient Aliens." Some Christian researchers, such as yourself, have come under fire by these, quote, discernment ministries for exploring ideas on the fringe of Christianity, whether it deals with UFOs, Nephilim, whatever the case is. The charge that's been levied is that even discussing the topic of UFOs is merely a repackaging of the ancient aliens theory to fit into a Christian worldview. And no doubt, there will be someone out there who tries to make such a claim about the very book we're discussing. How do you respond to the criticisms of people who say we shouldn't even touch topics like this?
Well, I've had this question asked on a couple of interviews I've done on this subject, and to me it gets into the nature of the kind of ministry that I perform, and that is that I see myself as a Christian apologist, and that means that you have to really engage with the culture. Someone that I think we both respect a lot, like the late Francis Schaeffer, was all about engaging with the culture. And he had a tremendous impact upon the evangelical church about trying to be relevant. In fact, even those folks that will be critical often cite Francis Schaeffer in calling us sort of postmodern believers, I guess. I've never thought of myself as postmodern, but apparently I am one. I are one. And but I think it's about being relevant. So I think engaging in the errors and to be more biblical, exposing, being a light to expose the darkness of the sort of evil thoughts and things that are out there that are in effect misleading people. You could say apostasies, but they're really just ideas such as Gnosticism. In fact, it's one of the kind of core ideas that I conclude the book with, is that in many ways, ancient alien theory is modern day Gnosticism, and that we can talk a bit more about that later if time allows.
Absolutely right. And I've mentioned before that we live in a culture where, polls have shown the vast majority of the population already believes in the supernatural, already believes in UFOs. They have no problem accepting that these things exist. Therefore, if they can't go to a Christian or a church or someone with a biblical worldview for answers about these things, they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to end up in New Age philosophies, or they're going to end up in the ancient aliens realm, because people there are all full of answers, aren't they? I mean,
they really are. Well, yeah, if you look at a couple of the books of the Bible, like the Gospel of John, the book of Colossians, they are specifically targeting Gnostics. And the pleroma, as it's called, and the fullness of God, the issue of emanations, the nature of God, the nature of God's interaction with the world. As John begins his gospel, he's directly coming against a heresy of Gnosticism and of Philo of Alexandria, that in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, but the Word was God. And that was a direct shot at Gnosticism. That the Creator was not a demiurge, not a middleman, not an emanation, but the Creator was God Himself in the form of His creative Word, the Logos. And so, so there's a very strong precedent that even is in the New Testament that says that we should interact with our culture to clarify, to bring out and to point out the truth that the culture may have, but also to point out its error. And so I think that's doing the work of the apologist.
So let's get into Mars, Doug. Let's talk about, fascination with Mars is nothing new. In your book, you discuss about how up until Mariner 4 took photographs of Mars in the 60s, there was rampant speculation about what was going on the surface of the red planet. Right. Authors and, just common people, they had fearful ideas, but also romantic ideas about what was happening up there. What were some of the ideas people had about Mars before we knew that it kind of just was this cratered up, desolate wasteland?
Yes, which it may or may not be, by the way.
Right.
It probably is. Well, you've got, I think probably the key factor, certainly there's a whole issue associated with science fiction and cultic beliefs, theosophy that fed into the fascination with Mars, but certainly science, modern science, has been a big factor going back into the 1870s, the 1890s. The study of Mars through the telescope, the astronomers, became a huge cultural phenomenon. At that time, the astronomers were kind of like our astrophysicists today. They were the wise guys, the really smart people that everyone wanted to go to their lectures. They wanted to hear what they had to say, because they were reaching out beyond the realm of the Earth. They were using these telescopes that only they could afford to have, and they were seeing spectacular things. And so it caught the curiosity of the public. You had really two famous Jesuit priests that were responsible for running the Roman observatory. And of course, today the Jesuits continue to run the Roman observatory. But back in the 1870s, you had a fellow named Giovanni Pietro Secchi, and then after him you had a fellow named Schiaparelli, and these actually no, it was Giovanni Schiaparelli, it was Angelo Secchi. These were the two Italians that were doing so much work studying and writing about and teaching about the planet Mars. And the Jesuits have always proposed and always been big believers in the plurality of worlds, believing that there are many worlds, that God is the creator of many planets with intelligence and so forth. So in some respects, the current, Michael Funes or the different Jesuits now that are outspoken on the subject that Tom Horn and Chris Putnam talk about in their book Exo Vaticana, that there has been this tradition to welcome the idea of multiple intelligences, even though that tends to run counter to what appears to be the sort of story arc of the Bible, which is that there's this, as L.A. Marzulli calls it, the cosmic chess match. There is this war going on between Jehovah and Lucifer, and that we are sort of the children of Jehovah that were captured by Lucifer, and our planet and what is happening on Earth is what I call the sort of the cosmically decisive planet in the universe. And of course, the plurality of worlds theory would suggest that our planet is so small, so insignificant that it really doesn't matter. And of course, I say, well, if that's true, then why did Jesus come and die for humankind if it's so insignificant? So right away, you have this conflict of worldviews, of frameworks, and but it was these two guys, Secchi and Schiaparelli, and then there were two other individuals that were really key. Certainly, the Frenchman Camille Flammarion, who was a fascinating character. We should probably talk a little bit more about him in detail. But Flammarion was a fascinating guy, very interested in the paranormal, a very studious cartographer, a map maker of Mars. And he was hugely influential, probably one of the most famous persons of his day all over the world. People knew who Flammarion was. And then the American Percival Lowell. Lowell came from a very wealthy family, Lowell, Massachusetts, named after that family, instrumental in the Industrial Revolution in America. Lowell was the sort of the rich kid. Percival Lowell was. His brother was the president of Harvard. He was trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He had plenty of money. So he got into the Martian studies when he first went to Japan in 1894, and he was there to study Shinto mesmerism, the trance states of the Shinto religion in Japan. And so Lowell was interested in that, but he quickly was also got connected to Mars. And this is one of the themes that you'll see throughout the history of Mars and its interest to human beings is there is a connection, and it's sort of a connection that cannot be broken between science related to Mars and the paranormal aspects of the interest in Mars. And but Percival Lowell became a hugely popular figure. He was sort of the Carl Sagan of his day. Carl Sagan in the 80s produced the PBS special Cosmos, wrote a book that accompanied that TV show. So he was a big figure, the guy that talked about billions and billions of stars. And but Carl Sagan was very much the popular guy, sort of the Michio Kaku of our time. But Percival Lowell was the same type of figure in the 1905, 1910, 1915 time frame. He passed away in 1916. But he popularized astronomy. And he was in newspapers, he was featured in magazines and periodicals, and he helped to generate what we know today as pulp fiction. The pulp fiction of the 1910s to 1950s were greatly influenced by Percival Lowell and his popularization of the planet Mars and of outer space. And his observatory, eventually one of his scientists actually was the guy that discovered the first planet X, which we know today as the mini-planet Pluto. And so there's just a huge connection between science, the paranormal, pulp fiction, and popular culture. And that's sort of the background to the whole story of my book, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet.
And Ancient Aliens does continue to play such a huge role in what we, in sort of this fascination with Mars, even right down to, I often wondered when NASA and scientists tend to have this obsession almost, it seems, to find life on Mars, whether it's microbial or whether they're looking for water on Mars. And I always thought, why are they so obsessed with this? What's the big deal? But, it does play into a deception of another kind, whether it is just the idea of how it would further the Darwinian paradigm that maybe Mars is kind of a future look at what our planet could become, if there once existed life there, is that the direction that we are headed in? And, it's interesting to me because this certain character in our history, one Miss Madame Blavatsky, she seems to continuously pop up in our story of our history and paranormal and this type of thing. And she plays a role in the concept of ancient aliens, and she is mentioned in this book of yours. And I have to say, because our mutual friend, Diana Learn, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the Atlantis connection, because that's something that Diana is interested in. Can you kind of explain how Blavatsky comes into this and how these theosophists played into the idea of ancient aliens and how that connects?
Sure. Yeah, in fact, another friend of Diana and I is a guy named Jason Colavito, and he's written a number of books very critical of ancient aliens. He's written from a naturalist, probably an atheist perspective, and yet we actually share and agree on a number of points. Certainly, we agree on this point that Madame Blavatsky was one of sort of the thought leaders in this notion that there were ancient civilizations on this earth with the civilizations had sophisticated, advanced knowledge, that they probably had the ability to use mental telepathy, channeling spirits. They had all of these incredible capabilities. They knew how to do things that we don't know how to do, just looking at these evidences of the megalithic monuments, be they Baalbek or Pumapunku or even the pyramids of Egypt. It seems as if we can't explain these things naturally. Well, now we might be able to. Chris White's done a good job of dealing with the sort of the hoaxery, the hokum, the hoaxes, perhaps, of some of these issues.
Right.
In his film Ancient Aliens Debunked, which I recommend that folks that enjoy this interview would probably enjoy looking at Chris's work. But Blavatsky believed in the secret doctrine. She believed that ancient Atlantis was, in fact, a real civilization. She had some kind of crazy notions about how long ago it might have been and when it might have been destroyed. She was thinking it was millions of years ago. The folks that really do believe Atlantis likely did exist would tend to picture its destruction probably in the range of 12 to 15,000 years before present. So sort of 10,000 BC, 11,000 BC. Which is an interesting date for a couple of other reasons, which we could talk about in terms of how it mirrors the eons of the Maya and so on. But anyway, Blavatsky was key. And another figure about the same time frame was a guy named Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly was a Minnesota congressman who had some very far-reaching interests and tastes, you might say. He wrote a very extensive, I think it was like a 500-page treatise on the subject of Atlantis. His book was, I think, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And in it, he put together an analysis of the different tales of Atlantis. And, of course, Plato, in his Critias, you might help me pronounce that better, the Timaeus, his work, Plato's work, was sort of the basis for the study of Atlantis and the beliefs that it did exist. And it certainly factored very much into the 2012 stories the former destruction of Atlantis, why was it destroyed, and so forth. So you have these interesting figures from the 19th century, and they were sort of coming along with their ideas, their fictional cultic ideas, at the same time that you had real scientists exploring the planet Mars. And many of these ideas tended to get wrapped together, particularly as Percival Lowell, Flammarion, and others began to contemplate the possibility that Mars was a dying planet, but it had human inhabitants, and they were seeing these canali that Schiaparelli had documented, that Percival Lowell probably went crazy on in terms of drawing pictures on his maps of all these lines on the surface of Mars. But their theory was that Mars was a desert world, a dying planet, and that there were people that lived there. They perhaps had moved underground, and all of these ideas kind of got carried forward into Edgar Rice Burroughs' works on The Princess of Mars, John Carter of Mars, that, of course, your listeners probably will recall a couple of years ago, Disney had a somewhat, I'd say, unsuccessful movie in John Carter of Mars, which is in itself an interesting story. A book's been written about that and all of the craziness that surrounded the making of that movie and the challenges. Burroughs always wanted that movie to be made, but he could never seem to get it done. And his success was always with his other character of fame, and that was, of course, Tarzan. So you have all of these fictional writers as well as the science writers, and then you have certain cult leaders that all participated in the creation of Mars as sort of this iconic figure, as Sagan says, that sort of became the focus of mankind's hopes and fears and sort of wistful yearnings for the future.
And of course, this fascination with the possibility of civilizations on Mars did not die down after we started receiving images of Mars. If anything, these images that we received have kind of created a whole new mythos about the planet. So most of us who've studied conspiracy and paranormal intrigue are familiar with the legendary face on Mars and the so-called Cydonia region. People like Richard C. Hoagland, who you reference in the book, have devoted a massive amount of time defending the idea that this, as well as other structures, indeed exist on Mars. And they float the theory then that Mars once harbored advanced civilization. In your book, you even cite the late Mac Tonnies, who wrote about the face on Mars and the Cydonian imperative. Incidentally, before he passed away, I had a really pleasant professional relationship with Mr. Tonnies, who, while he and I would no longer agree on most things because my worldview has changed, he was a really forward-thinking and interesting guy and did a lot of cool research on his blog, Post-Human Blues. As you point out in the book, evidence for the face is questionable at best, or what exactly it means, right. But there does seem to be a concerted effort on the part of NASA to actively cover up certain images and information. Talk to us about that. What's going on there?
Right. Well, in fact, you kind of alluded earlier to, why are our scientists still interested in Mars? Why are we sending space probes to Mars? Why do we have the Mars roving laboratory, the Curiosity? Why do we have it roving around on Mars doing experiments? And, I don't really talk about this in the book, but it really occurs to me that the reason we're doing it is that we're looking for another home. In the event that we foul our own nest, which, of course, many feel that we might, in terms of nuclear war or whatever, we've already preserved all the seedlings, in this ice bunker up in the Arctic, beyond the Arctic Circle, I guess in Norway or Iceland or wherever that is. There's these other ideas of alternative 1, 2, and 3, the possibility of creating a colony on Mars, and it really occurs to me that NASA is part of NASA's work is exploring the possibility that there is water there, that there are natural resources there that could lend themselves to the creation of colonies. And granted, they're not trying to get colonists there. At least I don't believe they are. There are some, such as David Wilcox and others, that suggest that we already have a massive underground colony on Mars, which we can discuss. But nevertheless, that may well be one of NASA's interests. The others would point out there's a book that was just published in December by a fellow in the UK. I think it's called The Secrets of Mars, or Mars Secrets, or whatever, and he talks about and brings to light a lot of photographs that I had not seen before. I just downloaded his book from Kindle, just a couple of weeks ago, and began to look at the photographs. Some fascinating things there. Photographs that we haven't seen that are from the South Polar region. Just some amazing configurations of different things, including the possibility of liquid water near the South Polar region. That the reason it's still liquid is because it's so extremely salty that even at 200 below zero, it can still be a liquid fluid. So there's all kinds of mystery still to explore, but it appears that this whole discussion could almost be a show unto itself. What is up with NASA? What's going on? Why is it that in 1966 Carl Sagan wrote a book with a Russian scientist named Skalovsky, I think is how you pronounce his name, talking about Mars and talking about intelligences in the universe? And they were fairly upfront at that time, and they said, as we look at, for instance, the satellites of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, we notice and we believe that Phobos is, in fact, a hollow moon. Well, nature doesn't create hollow moons, so it must be the case that Phobos is an artificial satellite. And so Sagan was fairly explicit about the possibility or the probability of intelligent life at that time, but you don't hear him say very much about it. Not long after his death, the movie Contact, a book that he'd written, was made, but it became pretty apparent that NASA was operating under some type of a general directive in which the issue of intelligent life, even if life of any sort, on the Martian surface should be minimized. And so on the one hand, I think that NASA is interested in demonstrating that life has existed or does exist on Mars, but it's also very interested in keeping that information to itself because it does not want to run into religious activists, let's say, that are saying, gee, NASA, you are raining on our parade. You are talking about life being created on Mars, and we all know that God created life only on planet Earth, and therefore you can't do that. There's this thing called separation of church and state, and so you should keep any opinions to yourself that might threaten the belief that God only created life on this planet, which of course is an idea that sort of sounds very much like the Catholic Church talking to Galileo back in the 17th century. But I feel pretty confident, and a number of others as well do. John Brandenburg, who is a plasma scientist that works at Alamogordo, has written a book called Life and Death on Mars. Brandenburg echoes the same thing. Basically says if you go to a conference on Mars, the simplest hypothesis many times is that, well, there's life on Mars. But life can never be allowed to be a hypothesis that anyone agrees with. It's verboten to confirm it. And there clearly has got to be sort of a philosophical reason why NASA has to avoid that discussion. And, of course, that's just simple life. If we get into the whole issue of UFOs and whether or not the U.S. government perhaps has made a pact of some sort with aliens, which many claim, I'm not sure that I necessarily believe that, but those issues are just the very simple issue of is there microbial life on Mars. That issue alone is something that NASA seems to be reluctant to confirm.
It's interesting because I was looking through my website earlier today to see how much I had actually written about Mars over the years. And an article came up that I wrote in 2009, and it just speaks to the fascination that people have because it's the shortest article. It's just a little blip of something that had come out from the Washington Journal, and it remains one of the most popular, most hit-on articles on my site. And it's yeah, and so interesting because all it is the title of the article is Astronaut Buzz Aldrin Claims There's a Monolith on Mars Moon. And it was just this really kind of cryptic quote that Buzz Aldrin made in 2009 that says, we should Go boldly where man has not gone before. Fly the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. When people find out about what they're going to say is, who put it there? Who put that there? The universe put it there. If you choose, God put it there. And that's what Buzz Aldrin said. And people are so fascinated by that article. And it's interesting because it goes along with what you were saying about how NASA does seem to be making this concerted effort to cover things up. And yet, these doggone astronauts that have actually been to outer space, they keep saying things that sparks the public interest.
No doubt about it. They themselves know more, of course. There's virtually every astronaut that went to the moon has a UFO story. I, in fact, was fortunate enough to have a scientist who works at JPL read an early draft of my book, and he was able to fill in some details for me and explain some things, and also correct some of my scientific inaccuracies. But he had an opportunity to visit with Buzz Aldrin over lunch one day and ask him. Said he finally got up enough nerve to ask Buzz Aldrin about the UFO that he saw when he was on the moon. And Buzz basically just looked at him and got red in the face and did everything he could to basically say, I really can't talk about it.
Wow.
That they're uncomfortable. Of course, Hoagland ventures the notion that all of these astronauts were somehow hypnotized or put through some manner of mind control to block them or to keep them from either wanting to or feeling free to talk about what they saw or helping them to forget what they saw. And it does seem as if there has been acknowledgement on the part of many scientists that we have encountered some type of intelligence, but how much detail about it is, of course, a matter of great speculation. There's all kinds of conspiracies, the so-called Magic 12 documents and all of that. I talk to some extent about that in this book, and I talk about why that might be. But to a great extent, I really focus predominantly on the issue of how these notions of Mars have influenced religions and, specifically kind of the popular view today in our culture about ancient aliens and the spiritual ideas associated with them, and what might it lead to in terms of the coming great deception that the eschatologists that talk about the future things that should come upon the earth, what that might have to do with it. And so it's hugely important, the whole notion of cover-ups, conspiracies, and in fact the discussion about the cosmic war, which we might have time to talk a bit about, the Joseph P. Farrell discussions, the nature of the war, the nature of what NASA knows about that, and even what NASA knows about the actual, potentially an actual civilization that existed on Mars or on an associated planet for which Mars was merely a moon, which the late David Flynn called the planet Rahab.
Let's talk about that right now. That's a good transition, and it's definitely challenging. It's definitely challenging to sort of the prevailing thought of the biblical worldview, and yet it does have a lot of interesting tie-ins. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, the sort of the first theory or the first point that you have to look at is you have to decide, what caused the asteroid belt. Why does Mars have these really strange looking moons that aren't round? They look like big potatoes, as you said earlier. And the theory that's been around for a couple of hundred years is that there is a perfectly mathematical explanation for why the planets are the size they are, why they are the distance they are. It kind of has to do with gravity, and I'm not a physicist, so I can't part, but it has to do with the shape of the planets and again where they fall. And there's been a theory, again, advanced for a couple of hundred years, that where the asteroid belt is, there should have been a planet at least as big as Saturn, not quite as big as Jupiter, but certainly much bigger than Mars, because Mars is only about a fourth the size of the Earth. Yeah, and so there is, considered opinions, I guess, of a number of folks that are smarter than me that believe that there was at one time a planet between Mars and Jupiter. And in fact, they would propose that Mars was not originally a planet at all. Mars was merely a moon to this planet. The planet's been called various things. It's been called Planet J, Planet K, Planet X. It's been called Krypton. The late David Flynn called it the planet Rahab. Rahab is mentioned a couple of times in the Bible. It seems to talk about Rahab as an enemy of God, as an enemy that God destroyed, that he broke into pieces. And Flynn proposes that this was, in fact, the planet that, when Lucifer rebelled, that his fallen angels and he took up residence primarily on the planet Rahab, and conjectures that it's perhaps the case that monuments were created by the fallen angels on Mars, perhaps even the face on Mars, which, as Flynn has shown and others have talked about, even Hoagland talks about it, it appears that the face on Mars is half simian and half leonine, or half looks like a lion and half looks like a human. And that is suggestive of the cherub and of the Sphinx. Now, the Sphinx is to be viewed obviously from the ground, looking up at it, but it appears to be the face of a human and the body of a lion. But a full-blown cherubim was to have really four features: the face of a human, the body of a lion, the sort of hind end of a bull, like Taurus the bull, and wings such as an eagle or as Draco. In fact, it tends to point to the idea that there were four cardinal points of the constellations of the zodiac, and that the cherubim, in effect, sort of related to or illustrated the four cardinal points of the zodiac. It's intriguing, of course, as a quick sidebar, that the Gospels of Christ, one of them, Matthew, tends to reflect upon Christ as the great king, sort of as Leo the king, that the Gospel of Mark tends to relate to Christ as sort of the suffering servant, the ox or the bull, whereas the Gospel of Luke tends to see Christ as the perfect fulfillment of humankind, tracing his birth all the way back to Adam. Jesus is the perfect human. And whereas the Gospel of John tends to see Jesus as a divine, more of a divine being, sort of with wings, kind of like an angel. So whether that's true or not is for people to decide on their own. But nevertheless, you do see these factors. You even see it in the ensigns of the tribes of Israel. All the tribes are to march under these four ensigns that reflected the zodiac, and so on and so forth. So there's all this interest. We know that the planet that should have existed between Mars and Jupiter is not there now, but we know the asteroid belt is there. So the theory is that this planet was destroyed in some type of cosmic war, as Joseph P. Farrell would suggest. Perhaps it was destroyed as judgment by Jehovah. This is not in the scripture. It's not really in an apocryphal book. It's sort of a supposition, a speculation based upon a couple of very obscure verses in the Bible and a study of the ancient mystery religions that David Flynn did in his book Cydonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars, a book that I find just to be tremendously fascinating and one that I read every so often because it has so much in it. But we know that there are some just amazing coincidences that perhaps aren't coincidences. And we could talk even more a bit about that. But going back to the issue of the exploded planet hypothesis, the scientist that really popularized this theory in the last 30 years was a scientist named, he was a Yale graduate, a PhD from Yale, named Tom Van Flandern. Van Flandern was an individual that Joseph B. Farrell referred to frequently in his books, talking about this. It's a discussion that the issue of what could have caused the planet to be exploded. It's an issue that's been taken up by a plasma scientist named Anthony Perrault, by a more of a geologist, perhaps an anthropologist of sorts, a guy named Robert Schoch, who is Schoch is a professor at Boston University. There are a number of threads that tie together that suggest that humankind, perhaps a pre-Adamic race, may have witnessed a massive destruction, what is called a plasma event, in which perhaps a plasma weapon of sorts destroyed the planet Rahab, perhaps 12 to 14,000 years ago, and that destruction was observed based upon a number of factors, cave paintings throughout the earth, especially those cave paintings in France, but even things as far away as Easter Island, the Rongo script of that Robert Schoch studied. Easter Island's where the giant heads, the Moai, are located. And in the script, this is documented in Anthony Perrault's paper, where he talks about really looking from a sort of an anthropologist perspective and looking at various hieroglyphics around the world, as well as these cave paintings, that human beings witnessed this. Well, if human beings witnessed this, and they recorded this in drawings or cave paintings, it couldn't have happened millions of years ago. It had to have happened relatively recently, certainly within the last 50,000 years, but the argument is by a number of folks that it probably happened within the last 15,000 years. And so then it kind of is in the same time frame as Atlantis and some of these ideas about how Atlantis was destroyed by a massive flood that sank beneath the sea. Well, this gets into the whole issue of what's known as the gap theory, the possibility that there's not one flood mentioned in the Bible, but there's really two floods. The first flood is a flood that occurred somewhere between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. That the flood was an enormous flood. It basically was so huge, it was much more violent than the flood of Noah. It was so violent, it destroyed all life on the earth. And that when we get into verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, we get into the discussion of God's separating the waters from the waters and in effect creating life on the earth. The gap theorist believes that God was recreating life on the earth, that life had been destroyed in some type of perhaps as a flood, perhaps as a rebellion, as a judgment against rebellion by Lucifer. And of course, this connects into this exploding planet hypothesis if one ties in the findings that Flynn discusses about mystery religions, and the idea that before humans were humans, that civilization came to Earth from Mars or from this associated planet discussed as Planet Rahab. So you're into some really amazing connections and stories that covers a lot of ground, and it is a fascinating possible explanation for what was transpiring, what we may still see the remnants of on the planet Mars. So I'll pause for a moment and see how your voice is doing.
Well, it's fascinating because as you talk about this, my mind goes two different directions. And one is that I find it so fascinating. And as you say, as a hypothesis, it does go a long way to explain some things that we know to be true. Right. The other side of it is I can literally hear the people who are saying things like, this is taking from these ancient mystery schools and trying to apply it to Christianity in a dangerous way. And to the people who would bring that up, I would just say that we have to remember that Satan is the counterfeit. not the other way around. And I find myself reminding people of that so often, because people are so quick to say, well, Ancient Aliens says this, so if you say anything even similar to that, then you are taking from them. Or if you apply something to your biblical worldview that is also reflected in pagan doctrine, then you are taking that and fitting it into your biblical worldview. But if we agree as Christians that Satan is a copycat and he is a counterfeiter, then we should be able to say that, knowing that God is the creator of all, that these things could have been taken from what we know to be true and applied in a false way to pagan philosophies.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a number of ways to respond to that. Certainly, first off, I don't necessarily have to believe the things I'm talking about to talk about them, right? These are ideas, they're theories, they're speculations. I know I did an interview with our friend Doug Hant, and he said, well, where are you going to find that in Scripture? And I said, well, you're not really going to find it in Scripture. You really can't. Scripture doesn't teach it. The Scripture may allow for it. There may be a couple of references in Scripture that may relate to it, but we don't know. I think it is a question of investigative detective work and trying to decide, does this explain things? Does it explain things better than some other hypothesis? And so in part what I'm doing in the book is I'm saying if there becomes a sort of disclosure event in which part of the evidence for that disclosure and for ET is that there was and there have been we have discovered ancient civilizations on Mars or on the moon. We've seen artifacts there. Those artifacts are going to be very compelling, and they're going to add to the deception. What I'm pointing out is that there could be ways to reconcile what we may discover when we go knocking over stones on Mars, that we may be able to reconcile those still with our conception, our framework, our biblical worldview. And so I offer these ideas as a way of familiarizing people with them, so that, just as Jesus said, this great deception is going to be so compelling, is going to be so amazing that the whole world is going to be led astray. Paul talks about the fact that there are going to be these signs and lying wonders in the heavens, and that everyone is going to believe, to the point where God even sends a strong delusion to help reinforce their belief, because they've chosen not to believe in his biblical revelation, but to believe in this lie that perhaps is really a lie generated by Satan, by Lucifer, as an explanation for where we came from, what our future destiny is, and so forth, which is what I believe, and I would say L.A. Marzulli would believe, probably Tom Ward would agree, Steve Quayle, a number of others, that this is the great deception of the last days. We believe that we are in those last days. We are down now to years, not quite months, maybe months, but years, but not necessarily even decades any longer. It could be very, very close. And it certainly seems that this whole notion of ancient aliens, UFOs, that this is a cosmic conspiracy, and it is absolutely an enormous deception. So I'm familiarizing people with things that they may not be familiar with, just how Mars has played into this sort of thinning of the veil, if you will, kind of a mind control project of sorts to get people comfortable with the idea that ET has been about for some time, and that when our officials, government officials, perhaps even admit or suggest or even mandate that we believe in these crazy things, that in fact we've heard about them before. We're not unfamiliar with them, and we even have possible explanations for them. So I would offer that as a justification for why it is important to evaluate and to examine these things. Many people believe them, and we could talk more about it, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, and I think that was probably my favorite thing about your book, that you do have this overarching concept that it is all of this information is something that can be used from, we'll call it the secular world, but we really know who's in charge of the world, to deceive us. And that's kind of their modus operandi, even right here on terra firma, where, they do these archaeological digs and they find things that, whether it's several years ago when they were talking about the ossuary that supposedly contained the bones of Jesus and this type of thing. And then they say, you see here, science, we've discovered this and it's amazing and it proves that Jesus existed, but he was just a man and now he's dead.
Right. Here are his bones.
Right.
Right.
So the fact that you point out in your book that it is important for us to at least consider these various hypotheses because we know that they will be used at some future point to deceive, I think is probably the most compelling argument that I've heard thus far for why Christians should study these type of topics in the first place. So I appreciate it.
No, I think that's right. And just to give one more example, I alluded to it a little bit earlier with John and his gospel. But it's important to understand that the notion of the Logos, the Logos, the Logos, was not a Christian concept. It was a pagan concept. It was a Gnostic concept. It was first really put down on paper by a contemporary of Jesus and of John, but he was probably became more famous after Jesus had died, and of course was resurrected, we believe. A guy named Philo of Alexandria, and he had talked about the Logos as a creative entity that was involved in the creation of the universe. The Gnostic notion was that it was that the universe was made of flawed material. It was matter that had a problem, and that was why evil existed in the world. So it was what's called in theology a theodicy. It was an explanation for evil. And it was important that there were intermediaries between God and matter or the world. And there were these notions of the demiurge or these notions of emanations. Each emanation between God and man or God and matter was less pure than God. And there was a point at which there was a being that was able to create. He was sufficiently God to have the power of God, but he was not so pure that he could not interact with matter. And that was the Logos. That was the Logos of Philo of Alexandria. And that is why that, John decided to begin his gospel, one of the gospels that, evangelicals tends to like best. He began his gospel with the notion of Philo's Logos. But he used the Logos to communicate. He used the error of the Logos of Alexandria to communicate the truth of the Logos, which he said, in the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God. So far, we're consistent with Philo. But then he said, but the Logos was God. That goes on to clarify, all things that came into being through the Logos. And nothing that came into being without the Logos. Well, the reason he worded it just that way was to correct the error of Philo of Alexandria. And so, in effect, what you have is a very biblical concept, a Logos, actually was taking a concept of paganism, and it was using that concept to clarify the true meaning of Jesus Christ. You had exactly the same idea, as I mentioned earlier, with Paul and the Colossians, using the concept of the pleroma, or the fullness of God. Paul was already dealing at Colossae with this idea of Gnosticism, the idea that there was something about Christ that was not fully God. He couldn't have been fully God, because if he was fully God, then he could not have created the world. He had to be an intermediary. He had to be an emanation. But he used this term pleroma, the fullness of God. And he was basically saying Christ was the fullness of God. He wasn't a part God, part human. He wasn't an emanation. He was fully God. That's why he said very cleverly, all of the fullness of God dwelt in him in bodily form. And of course, that is just absolutely shocking. How could the fullness of God dwell in the body of Jesus Christ? And of course, this is the mystery of godliness. This was the reason that eventually, after 300 years, there was this Council of Nicaea to try to explain how it was possible that God could dwell in bodily form. So, in other words, this notion of Gnosticism was so ingrained in the mythos and in the mindset of the ancient world that Christianity, on the one hand, fitted that world quite well, but on the other hand, it was still Jewish enough that God had to have been in a body. He could not, without being in that body, he could not have suffered and he could not have died for us. And so, Christianity is an amalgamation of Jewish and Greek thought. But Gnosticism had to be clarified just as Judaism had to be clarified, and that's what Christianity did. And we have the same issue in our day today with Ancient Aliens. Ancient Aliens is a Gnostic like belief that somehow there were these aliens that were far superior to us. They were demigods. They were advanced beings, and they somehow brought us along. They nurtured us. They even tampered with our genome to create a superior being, a smarter, more intelligent being that took these sort of ape-like creatures, Homo sapiens, if you will, and turned them into Homo sapiens sapiens. And so, in effect, trying to clarify by explaining to the ancient alien theorists where they may be right and where they may be wrong is exactly the way that Paul and the way that John were trying to use the truth about Christianity to explain to their world view, the people in their world, in their time, why Christianity was like it in part, but different in part, and help them explain it in such a way that people could realize it, recognize it, understand it, and ultimately believe in it.
That is so fascinating, and you're right. It is something that we continue to deal with today, whether it's through Ancient Aliens or whether it's through even just the atheist notion of the copycat saviors and how the pagan beliefs came prior to the concepts that we have that are biblical, and the way that you just explained it is fascinating, and it's wonderful to know that these answers are in Scripture, and it is important to get a deeper understanding.
It is. It's, to me, it's in one word, it's relevance.
Yes.
And I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about that too in his theology. It's how do we make the gospel relevant? Each day, each age, each eon, they're different, and we have to find the right language, the right concepts that make the truth relevant in our age. There are a lot of our brethren that are good, very sincere Christians, and they'll use certain language and vernacular. They'll talk about they love these hymns. Revive us again, or these concept of revival, soul winning. I kind of chafe at those ideas. To me, those ideas they are so old fashioned. They're 150 years old or 180 years old. They just don't speak to me. That doesn't mean they're wrong. They're just wrong for me. And so what I think, Natalina, I think what you're trying to do, I think what I'm trying to do, what others are trying to do is we're trying to find a way to distill the truth of the Scripture, the truth of what God has taught us, revealed to us, and we're trying to find a way to relate to our peers, our colleagues, the people that live in this time, and we're trying to clarify. Here's what Christianity means in terms that you can understand. That does not mean we have to compromise the truth. It just means we have to make it relevant.
Indeed, and relevancy is something that I do talk about a fair amount because, we see, whether it's the seeker-friendly church, we see this desire of the mainstream modern evangelical movement to be relevant, but right. Unfortunately, they seem to define relevancy as what the world looks like, whether it's, you know, creating these mega churches with really cool hip pastors and, you know, trying to
personality cults.
Yes, exactly, to sort of romance the Generation X and Generation Y, when in reality, if they really wanted to be relevant, they would take the things that are on people's minds, whether it's, you know, the popularity of Ancient Aliens or the idea of the supernatural that everyone seems to universally believe in, and talk about those things that would make us as a church relevant.
Well, that's right, and there's no doubt that so much of what happens in composing, you know, the seeker-friendly church, the sort of desire to make the gospel communicate to our day and age, you have to be careful that you don't cut out part of the gospel. Yeah. You know, my argument against a lot of the dominionism and the ideas is that are so often advanced in the megachurches is they really are compromising the truth of the gospel. It's not that they're you know, basically just trying to make it sort of relevant to the culture. They're really taking big chunks of the gospel and they're throwing it away. They don't necessarily believe in the second coming. Predominantly, they don't believe in the reality of evil. You know, they basically think evil is sort of just stinking thinking. It's just not conceiving of God the right way, of our guilt and our sin. You know, we just need to get past a lot of these old ideas because they just believe that it's just a psychological problem, rather than seeing evil as sort of a metaphysical reality. And so they talk about dominion, taking dominion, because they don't believe that there really is real evil in the world that has to be eradicated ultimately by the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. They believe that the church can bring about salvation just through making the church more relevant to society, without recognizing that the church itself is I would call it more like a lifeboat. It's like, get as many people on the lifeboat as possible. We're not going to get everybody on the ship. The ship is sinking. Let's get people on the lifeboat. You know, and so there is a fundamental difference of opinion regarding the nature of what the gospel is and what is the work that we should be about. That's why they want to get so involved in politics. More Bible-believing Christians are reluctant to get in politics because they believe that evil is so interwoven into the fabric of our society that you really can't fix the problems. That doesn't mean you should never be involved, but there's the concept that there's only so much that we can do until the problem of evil is dealt with in society and in our personal lives. We are not going to fix the problems of humanity. And that's it, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And that actually transitions, this is a little bit of a change of subject, but excuse me, I want to get into another concept that you bring up in your book, and that does have to do with the government and their interesting connection to the subject, the topic of UFOs. There's a really fascinating portion of your book that discusses the idea that our minds play a role in the increase of UFO sightings. Yeah. And in that chapter, you talk about Nick Redfern's research into the Collins elite. The Collins elite even exists is a subject of fascination for me. Right. And I've had the pleasure of talking a little bit with Pastor Ray Boucher, who is, of course, personally involved in the revelations about the existence of that group. So,
right.
Who are the Collins elite? What is it that they believe about the UFO phenomena, and kind of how does it relate to the idea that our minds may actually work as receivers or transmitters that directly impact the experiences we have with what we would call UFOs?
Yeah. Well, there's several pieces to your question. One, Collins Elite is a group that Nick Redfern in his book Final Events, or is it called Final Event? Singular. But anyway, in his book, he talks about the Collins elite. It comes from Collins, New York. It was related to a group that was, I don't know if it was Ray Boucher or who it was, that was from Collins, New York, but one of their consultants was. that knew something about demonology, and they began to develop. It was a group of individuals that were in the intelligence services. They may have been in military intelligence, but they came together as part of sort of a black project, off the books, if you will, but funded by the CIA. And they were formed in the early part of July 1952, right around July the 4th. And within 2 weeks, the first major event occurred, which was the so-called Washington Flap. It was for 2 successive weekends in the month of July 1952. UFOs buzzed the Capitol building. It buzzed Washington, D.C. It was seen by thousands of people. It was on radars. They even, both times, they scrambled jets, USAF. In fact, in one of my books, I talk about the USAF versus the UFOs. And they were trying to get behind these UFOs and potentially take a shot at them. They couldn't. The UFOs were traveling at about Mach 3, and they could only travel at about Mach 1. But already at that time, UFOs were beginning to become sort of an issue in public consciousness, and so there was already a study going on of the paranormal. The Roswell incident in 1947, it kind of kicked this off. There was work being done by a guy named Andrija Puharich, who was a very colorful figure that I talk about in a number of my books, and actually is the uncle of a good friend of mine. So I know a little bit about him from a personal standpoint as well, not just what's talked about in the books. But anyway, Puharich had done a lot of studies for the military, for military intelligence, and I'll kind of drop him and move on to the Collins Elite. The Collins Elite began to study the UFO phenomenon, and they eventually got into the study of the alien abduction phenomenon as well. The first sort of famous alien abduction was, I believe it was, and you may help me here, Natalie, I think it was in right around 1960 or so.
The Fred and Barney Hill?
Yes.
Or not Fred and Barney. Who was it?
Well, not Fred and Barney, though. That's the Flintstones. Meet the Flintstones. Have a yabba dabba do time. Oh, it was Barney Hill and his wife, whatever her name was.
Yeah. Not Fred.
We can call her Frida if you want to. Frida and Barney Hill. But I think it was about 1960. I remember seeing him on, this is going to date me, it was an old Sunday night. Well, it wasn't Sunday night. It was Thursday night, I think. It was To Tell the Truth. It was an old quiz show, and Barney Hill was on the quiz show. And he was one of the, 3 contestants that would, 2 of the contestants would try to lie, and they would say they were Barney Hill, and they would, give a part of the story. But he was, of course, the real guy, and he talked about his story about being abducted. He and his wife were abducted and so forth. This was sort of the first popular awareness of alien abduction. The reality is that it happened for hundreds of years. People had been sucked through fairy circles back in the UK and in Ireland especially. And it was kind of the same phenomenon. But in modern times, they were abducted by aliens. And so the Collins Elite began to study this alien abduction phenomenon, and they came out with a very strange conclusion that was sort of not expected for a government group, and that was that this alien phenomenon was probably demonic rather than extraterrestrial. These aliens were probably sort of interdimensional. It tended to echo the work of Jacques Vallée. Someone calls him sort of I think it was Mike Barra that called him the thinking man's UFOologist. And but that's what they came to, this conclusion. And you may offer a little bit here, though, on Ray Boucher and kind of his connection, because I have not had a chance to listen to any of the interviews. I know Derek Gilbert did a nice interview with him as well. I haven't listened to yet, but you might share a minute about kind of what you know about him.
Well, I've just only recently become acquainted with him, and what I can say about him, Future Quake did a really good interview with him. That probably what I'll do is I'll link to it in the show notes. But he says he was approached by this group for sort of his spiritual advice about the nature of the UFO, and that he himself is has done an incredible amount of research into Fortean topics, and so he was sort of an authority on that, and he was approached by this government agency for his knowledge on the topic, because they claim, it's such an interesting story, but with the Collins elite, they claim that they had witnessed these interdimensional creatures and had reason to believe or come to the conclusion that there was a spiritual component to the problem of UFOs. And what I can say about Ray and the little bit that I know about him is that for those who might conclude that maybe he made it all up or whatever, he is a very sincere man, and he's a very kind man, and he's a very he's a good man of faith, and I have no reason to believe that he would have any need to make up such a story. I mean, surely it wasn't that he was looking for fame or anything along those lines. Most people haven't heard of him.
Right.
So yeah, it's a very interesting story. I'll link to that an interview or two with him.
Yeah. Now the broader question you ask is really about the role of mind in UFO manifestations, and that it actually kind of fits into the sort of the general theory of the book, which Gary Stearman did a nice job of sort of pointing this out to me. I said, well, I guess you're right, Gary. This really was what I was saying, which is that because at one point in time I talk about the thesis behind the role of mind, is that our minds are not a passive receptacle that we just sort of sense things and see things, but this is almost Kantian for those that know about Immanuel Kant, but is that our minds don't just filter, but they actively construct reality to some extent. And as it relates to the whole notion of the paranormal, you see this in all of the spiritualists back in 1885, Harry Houdini and all that. You even see it in the movie Ghostbusters. When Slimer the Green Ghost, comes down the hall and hits Bill Murray and knocks him over, and Bill says, they say, "What happened to you?" And he says, "I've been slimed." Well, that was the ectoplasm, right? So there's a sort of a physical characteristic of this ultra-dimensional being. And, L.A. Marzulli talks a bit about this. Roger Lear, the gentleman that, the doctor that does the alien implant, sort of pulling this out. The issue is that there is a physicality to the UFO phenomenon, but there is also a spiritual aspect of it as well. But it does seem to be true that in the appearances of ghosts, that table levitation, some of these things, that there has to be sort of a cooperation between human beings that sort of have to consciously open the door, open a portal to let in these powers from beyond. Where Collins Elite, where Nick Redford gets into this in particular, is the whole issue of Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, and then, I talk about the fact that Parsons that Parsons used to host. It wasn't exactly a seance, but it was a group of science fiction writers. And Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, sort of in the 1947 same time frame as Roswell, they had done this thing called the Babylon Working Ritual. And this ritual was done to sort of conjure the horror of Babylon. And it was their belief that they had opened a portal. In fact, the Collins Elite believed that they had opened a portal, and that the material that came through this portal, the so-called memory metal and some of these other objects, in fact, they suggest that this material shows itself to have come somewhere from, near the center of the galaxy. And it would have taken, how many thousands of light years for that information, for that material to have come to us. And so it was almost as if there were beings that were trying to prove that their origin was from, 65 million light years away or whatever, and that the Roswell experience wasn't just a UFO sighting, but it was a means to deposit physical artifacts that could help prove their case. And so I just sort of had a little thought experiment there in that chapter, and I said, it seems to me that it's interesting that when Parson did these rituals, and then he had all these science fiction writers that got together and they started writing more and more about science fiction and familiarizing the public with these ideas of flying saucers and so forth, that lo and behold, flying saucers started happening more and more and more. And then in our times, doesn't take much effort to search for individuals that actually, by thinking about UFOs, all of a sudden they began to appear in their vicinity. This, in fact, even happened in the Collins Elite story that Redfern tells, and that became very worrisome to them, that the government individuals, officials that were working with them began to invite mediums, if you will, individuals that could help manifest these UFOs, and they started doing that. So it's phenomenal. But the point I'm making overall in the book, which is really what Gary was suggesting to me, is that there is preparation going on in the mental sort of collective mind. I don't know what you think, Natalina, about the idea of the sort of Jung's collective mind, but the notion that there might be some sort of mental collective mind or collective spirit that humans plug into. But to the extent that might be true, it certainly seems that if you condition more and more and more of humanity to believe in the possibility of UFOs or of extraterrestrials, of aliens, that it's more and more likely that they're going to appear more frequently. And so the gist of the story is that we are, sort of the victims of a massive mind control program that's been going on, foisted upon us by spirits that have been around for the last 150 years. And Mars has been a major part of their story and part of what they're trying to sort of get us to believe in, along with the broader UFO phenomenon, the ancient alien phenomenon, and so forth. They're conditioning us, getting ready for this full disclosure, which I do talk about in the book, that that I believe accompanies the disclosure of the Antichrist.
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly reason to suggest that the mind plays a role. I mean, even just to the old axiom of the mind is the devil's playground, right? It certainly is worth noting that the very concept of concentrating or thinking about matters that are from a darker perspective could invite that in. So it's interesting, and it's worthy of considering. And along those lines, now we promised at the beginning of this show that this was going to be we're going to go down some rabbit holes here. So
right, exactly.
It wouldn't be beyond extraordinary if we didn't take it beyond a little bit. So there's this legend about a mad Arab who accidentally happened upon a ritual by a cult of Tiamat, in which an ancient one known as Cthulhu was conjured into our realm. Uh-huh. And this mad Arab's testimony is outlined in the foreword and the epilogue to what is now famously known as the Simon Necronomicon. And I was so surprised and intrigued to see that this controversial grimoire was mentioned in your book. It ties into what we touched on a little bit previously in this interview about H.P. Lovecraft and his concepts of the ancient ones, the old ones that could be connected to modern ancient alien thought. So talk to us a little bit about that. How did that factor into your research?
Well, I was fortunate enough, that's what happens when you write a book over at least a year's period of time, that you happen upon new books that come into play that might just be perfectly well timed to give you some new insights. I was fortunate enough to have Peter Levenda write a book on this subject called The Dark Lord. I had an opportunity. I hadn't listened to Levenda talk about this until just a few days ago. Derek Gilbert, our friend, did an interview with Lavinda that you might want to link to as well, because it gets into this discussion.
Sure.
But Lavinda talked about three characters in The Dark Lord. He talked about Aleister Crowley. He talked about H.P. Lovecraft, and he discussed also a guy named Kenneth Grant, who was a successor, basically, to Aleister Crowley. We've talked about Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons has a very direct connection with Aleister Crowley. Crowley was the famous black magician who first encountered Horus, which is connected to Mars, by the way, in 1904 when he was in Cairo. His wife Rose and he were involved, in which he was sort of channeling a spirit who came to him, and then later in 1907 he was channeling as well the books of Thelema. Or Thelema or Thelema, depending upon how you pronounce it. And I ask you, Natalie, to tell me how to pronounce it. But it's Thelema, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's how I say it.
Yeah. And Cthulhu as well. It was actually H.P. Lovecraft's fictional character who was this part octopus, part dragon, part sort of dragon. He had giant claws. Supposedly he was the high priest of the Old Ones, and he lived in the deepest, darkest ravine of the ocean, and had lived on Earth for aeons. And aeons is a very interesting connection. That's the connection with Gnosticism, by the way, because Lovecraft's idea of aeons is not just a period of time, but it's more than that. But nevertheless, you had Crowley, who believed in a very dark religion, the religion of Horus, the religion of the child. Crowley was very angry against traditional patristic religion, such as monotheism. All monotheists, the Islam, Judaism, Christianity, were monotheists, although we Christians have, a little tweak to that called the Trinity. But the religion of the child, the religion of Horus, for Crowley was we think of the child as sort of pedantic, uncontrolled, willful, the terrible twos, all of that. And that was sort of his concept of the religion of Thelema, that it was the religion of will, of self-will, that kind of to thine own will be true. The actual proverb escapes me, but it has basically the sort of the proverb of Thelema religion is that there should be only one will, and that should be my will. That's the only will that matters, more or less. And so, in other words, don't be captive to the will of God, to the will of the church, to the will of any institution. You should only be about your own will. Kenneth Grant and the others would talk more about it being the religion that came originally from a Frenchman that had written a book back in the 16th century, and he talked about a giant, interestingly enough, named Gargantua, and his son, and the theme was an antinomian abbey, basically a religion of antinomianism, which means a religion that is against laws governing us. And it was a long story, a mythos, basically, about breaking away from any kind of laws. It was men that lost their virtue because they were governed, the monks were governed in this monastery by too many laws, too many rules. And so, in effect, the essence of the Crowley religion, the Thelemite religion, was, the fewer the rules, the better. And then where it really went, though, from this sort of concept of an antinomian religion, was a religion that embraced the conjuring of demons and spirits, and, in effect, extraterrestrials, otherworldly beings. And for Crowley, it became a sexual experiment or ritual in which you would conjure these beings, and you would do so in order to have sex with them, and they with you. So it tied into the incubi, succubi concept. And Grant, the successor, was even more explicit about this, that it is all, that true religion is just about conjuring these otherworldly beings and having sexual encounters with them. And that was, in effect, the essence of the Typhonian cult of Kenneth Grant. And of course, Peter Levenda talks about all of this in The Dark Lord, and he talks about the god Horus, the god Set, the Aeon of Horus, the Aeon of Set. And then he talks about how H.P. Lovecraft's this very dark, sinister fiction was influential in Kenneth Grant's concepts of encountering evil and the dark side, if you will, very much kind of related to like Darth Vader and the dark side of the Force. That was a necessary element in any kind of sort of true religion, that you had to be able to encounter the dark side. So, what was interesting to me, in a way, was that it was, in effect, Lovecraft, although Lovecraft considered himself writing only fiction, and he was, in effect, using ideas out of Theosophy, out of Blavatsky, to help make his fiction darker, danker, more interesting, more sinister, that it was okay from Grant's perspective that it was fictional based as long as it scared the what out of people, and it helped them encounter the evil that they needed to encounter in order to have a true religious experience. And so Levenda talks about all this in The Dark Lord. And so you get, once again, this notion of encountering aliens, extraterrestrials, and of course, so much of Lovecraft's fiction was about otherworldly beings that lived far away, and they came to Earth, and that eventually they would come to Earth again to reclaim their basically their planet, and that we were their little pet project, kind of like Zecharia Sitchin talked about. So I probably rambled too much, but that's sort of how these things came together. And Levenda is very an interesting guy, as some have theorized. I think even Derek Gilbert would be willing to admit that he believes that Levenda is in fact that Simon is the nom de plume for Peter Levenda, and that Peter Levenda himself, who was quite the expert on the occult, actually wrote the Necronomicon, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, I've had that theory myself. It's interesting because just before, I would say in the months prior to me becoming a Christian, I really became interested in the idea, the myth behind the Necronomicon. And I read a book, and I want to say it's called Dead Names, and it's supposedly authored by Simon. And this book is it's supposedly a story about how the Necronomicon, the Simon Necronomicon, was found, how it came into existence, how these people throughout the 1970s on up protected the Necronomicon and worked to publish the Necronomicon and all of the exploits around it. And Peter Levenda plays into that story. He's named in that book. And
I don't know if you knew this, but Derek indicates that he did some, this is what he told me, that he had done some research, and then in the Library of Congress, that it's indicated in the Library of Congress material that Simon is the pen name that was chosen by Levenda in writing this book.
Oh, I love it. It's a mystery.
Yes, it really is a conspiracy of sorts. Now, he's asked Levenda, and Levenda denies it, probably laughs it off, but that's just because I think, Levenda is such a funny character, because he seems to be well aware of so many theological concepts, and yet he's so plugged into some of these really dark occultic things as well. Mm-hmm. His personal story that he talks about quite a bit, and when he went to Colonad, Dignidad in South America, when he was doing his Nazi hunting in Argentina. I mean, just a fascinating guy. The sinister books that he's written, about sinister forces, the trilogy and sort of the occult in America. He's certainly a great resource. Now, what he really believes and what sort of religious philosophy, if any, he lives by, I don't know. But he's certainly a student of the occult, and there's no question he's probably the leading authority today on so many of these topics.
Yeah, he's definitely plugged in on some level. He knows what's going on. And the interesting thing about the Necronomicon, of course, it was first mentioned by H.P. Lovecraft in his fiction, and he talks, of course, about Cthulhu and all of these things. And the Simon Necronomicon sort of tries to portray itself as a legitimate grimoire that was, as I mentioned, the whole mad Arab story about how he came upon it in the desert, and he went crazy with all of the knowledge of the spells that he learned and all of these things. And, whether there's any truth to that or whether it's this created myth, is you can find endless forums online debating the topic.
No doubt. Jason Colavito certainly talks about it in his book, where he's trying to, expose ancient aliens and talks about he was just sort of aghast that people actually believe the Necronomicon is in fact a real book written by a real person and so forth. So, of course, Colavito is probably too much the skeptic, I would argue, but nevertheless, his research into it is certainly valuable.
Well, it occurs to me that, if anything, the Cthulhu mythos and the idea of the ancient ones or the old ones is at least a little bit more honest than the Ancient Aliens theory, because in Ancient Aliens, of course, they try to present it as our creators and ultimately our saviors, whereas the Cthulhu mythos is, when these guys come back, they're going to eat us.
Exactly. Yeah, we're just kind of a farm that they go down and chomp us all up. So I agree. It is absolutely true. I think Colavito sort of makes the same point about the Raelians and the Scientologists. At least they're honest, he says. At least in their view, the extraterrestrials, it leads to a religion. Whereas ancient alien theorists just sort of they want to talk about, isn't this cool, isn't this interesting, isn't this fascinating, but they don't really deal with the sort of the religious implications of what they're fascinated by.
Right. Yeah. Well, Doug, I guess we're running a little bit low on time, but I do want to just say this. I can remember when I was in college and I was taking an art history class. Mm-hmm. And we were studying, just art throughout world history. And there was one day I had my professor was this woman who I'll never forget because she was just so wacky and new agey and flower power, the whole thing. And I, at the time, just thought she was awesome. I wanted to be her. And one day she came into class and it was during a time where we were talking about prehistoric art. And she said, I'm going to play a movie for you that really is going to get you to look at these drawings and the cave art and all of this in a new and interesting way. And she put this video in, and of course at the time it was just VHS, and it was the documentary version of Eric von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods. Yes. And here it was and I watched it. I was wrapped with awe. I was fascinated by the whole thing. And, she presented it as this really viable option and explanation as to some of these artifacts that we have from our ancient history. And so it is. Of course, this is years before the History Channel Ancient Aliens phenomenon.
1970, 1975, in that time frame when Van Daniken first wrote his first books and the documentary. There were TV programs. I'll talk a bit about this. The Rod Serling, In Search of Ancient Aliens, and then just the TV series that Leonard Nimoy narrated, In Search of.
Right.
But go ahead, finish your story.
Well, and it occurs to me as I think back on this, because I was a smart girl, and I had a good head on my shoulders, but I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I thought this was the best evidence I'd ever heard, and it explained a lot of things to me that had troubled me. And I became someone who sort of, in spite of myself, adhered to the idea that, of course, we are the children of ancient aliens, or at least the progeny. Yes. And the fact that this has been part of my personal journey, it bothers me when I hear a lot of people say things like that this ancient aliens thing is new, that it's this new fascination, it's this new phenomenon, and if anybody in the Christian world talks about it, that we're just playing into a fad. But the reality is that whether you go back as far as Helena Blavatsky or you come all the way forward to the History Channel, it's a common theme that has run through the years. Yes. So on that note, I would like for you to just kind of summarize again for us how this factors into the research that you've done with this book, and ultimately what the takeaway is.
Yeah, well, that's right. It is a cyclical thing, and yet it has been persistent, certainly over the last 200 years, more so the last 150 years. It really is the ramification of our civilization, our societies, throwing out the concept of a creator God that created the universe, ex nihilo, out of nothing. It is replacing the God who created the stars with gods from the stars. And it is sort of that storyline that has been preoccupying scientists, atheists, occultists, cultists for this really the last century and a half. And the argument that I move towards at the end of the book is dealing with what I believe is going to be the disclosure. I argue that disclosure is happening now, bit by bit. There will ultimately be a major disclosure that I think will accompany the disclosure of the Antichrist. I think that part of the Antichrist disclosure will be an ancient aliens theme of some sort. I think it's possible that there will be artifacts that they may talk about. Well, let's tell you about what the face really was on Mars, what it amounts to, what these triangles, what these pyramids on Mars are all about. That it may be part of that disclosure event. But ultimately, there are a number of us that believe that it's very conceivable. I'm not sold 100%, but I think it's very conceivable that the mark of the beast will somehow be a genetic splice. It may even be claimed that it's from the extraterrestrials that have provided for us a genetic splice that will eliminate perhaps a plague that will be sort of all over the human race, which is kind of what happened in the movie I Am Legend or Legend. That may be part of the story. We don't know, but it looks like that it is going to be part of the real core, the crux of this disclosure, this final great deception. And it's for that reason that I wanted to write this book, give people a context for it, and help them understand that as the veil is thinned more and more, as more and more people believe in this, that it gets closer and closer and closer to coming about. And so it is something to not pass off as just a fad. It is a genuine threat. And that certainly is, like David M. Jacobs talks about, one of his books about alien abductions is called The Threat. It's what Nick Redfern meant really when he was dealing with the final event. It's this fear that the aliens plan to take us over. And we would say, in the context of the Christian eschatology, it's the ultimate plan of Lucifer that he would take over us, and he would try to repossess us. Christ broke us free from his ownership, if you will, but he wishes still to overcome what Christ did, and what he hopes to do with the mark of the beast is to recreate us in his image, the transformation of humanity into gods. And so that is sort of the mythos, if you will, and I mean that not as a fabrication, but as sort of the storyline behind what I think is a very possible scenario now in the very near future. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Well, it certainly ties into the oldest lie in the book, right? About ye shall be as gods, and so it's a worthy topic to discuss. The book is fascinating. I loved it. I'm sure that I will reference it often, and I recommend that everyone listening go out and pick it up, because the fact is, as much as we discussed in this interview, there is 3 times that much information in the book. You certainly will find things that we didn't even begin to touch on.
That's right.
So if people want the book, Doug, where can they get it?
Certainly, two locations right now. One would be Amazon. If you just want the book, you can get it on Amazon. You can just do a search for Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, or you can do a search under S. Douglas Woodward. It'll come up. If you want sort of the deluxe package, Prophecy in the News is offering the book now at their bookstore. They will be offering it along with the DVD that I did called Transforming Humanity into Gods. They will also offer another DVD that I did, in which I did a 1-hour presentation entitled Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. I did last summer. And another DVD that I did, which is on mind control. And finally, I think there's a DVD also from Mark Biltz talking about the blood moons and the signs in the heavens that he talks about. So it's that whole package. I think is $39. The book on Amazon I think is being priced at now about $18. And love it if people pick up a copy and give me feedback.
Awesome. And I'll make sure that I put all of those links in the show notes so that people can access it really easily. Doug, you're our very first repeat guest on Beyond Extraordinary.
I'm so honored. Well, the fact is you and I are able to talk about things that, that I can't talk about these things with most people I know. So it's fun to have a chance to do the show with you.
Well, and I look forward to having you on again with any new work that, there's stuff that you've written we haven't even talked about yet.
We need to talk about Power Quest 2, no doubt about it.
Yes. So
we need to cover those things too.
Absolutely. So I'm definitely going to have you on again. And thank you so much for being such a great guest.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Good night, Doug.
Good night.
You've been listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina. For the latest headlines and program schedule, please visit extraordinaryintelligence.com.